The island of Patmos was a piece of rock in the middle of the Aegean Sea. No glory, no comfort, no prospect of return for a man of his age. The Roman Empire had sent an old man named John to that place with a very clear purpose: that he would be forgotten, that his influence would fade with the passing of years, slowly, like an ember that receives no more breath of wind. The plan had worked with others: exiled philosophers, silenced prophets, religious leaders sent to the ends of the civilized world, so that their voice would no longer reach the ears of those who mattered. The island measured just over 13 kilometers in length. Limestone rocks, a bay open to the northern winds that in the winter months lashed anything exposed to the elements with the cruelty that the Mediterranean climate reserves for its moments of least mercy. The inhabitants were few. The exiles, marginalized by a condition imposed by imperial decree, lived in a kind of social limbo, present but invisible, existing but not belonging, surviving but without the purpose that had given meaning to every day before the exile. Rome had discovered that the death of certain men turned them into martyrs, and that martyrdom had the inconvenience of multiplying the message instead of silencing it. Exile was more efficient. It left the man alive but robbed him of his reach. It left the voice intact but placed it in a location where no one could hear it. John had survived things that few survive. He had lived decades beyond the expectation of anyone who had observed closely the persecution falling upon the followers of the way. He had buried companions. He had seen churches born and suffering and persevering, and sometimes faltering and then rising again. He had written. He had taught. He had carried within himself the lived memory of days that the Christian faith could never recover in the same way. The days when Jesus himself had been present in flesh, when the voice that created the universe had been audible to physical ears, when the hands that sustained all things could be touched by human fingers. But God had not finished with John, the apostle who had rested his head on the Lord's chest at a Last Supper on a Thursday night, when the world still did not know what the dawn of the following day would bring. The son of Zebedee, who had stood at the foot of the cross, while the others fled through the darkness of the early morning with a broken heart, looking at the face of the Son of God and not yet understanding what that death meant. The same one who had run to the empty tomb on Sunday morning, breathless, with his heart racing between fear and a hope that did not yet dare name itself. Who had seen the risen one, who had eaten grilled fish with him by the shore of the lake, who had received the promise of the Spirit and seen that promise fulfilled with fire and wind on the morning of Pentecost, who had survived decades of persecution, attempts at execution, banishment. That man was still alive, still on his knees on the cold stones of Patmos, and the Spirit reached him. It was the Lord's day. John closed his eyes. He felt the weight of the vision descend upon him like a wave that asks no permission, that awaits no invitation, that announces itself with no diplomacy. And when he opened his eyes again, he was no longer in Patmos. He was no longer in time. He stood before the end of all things, before the last page of a story that had begun with a garden and would end with a throne. The vision was not like a vague dream that dissolves at dawn. It was more real than anything physical eyes could register, more solid than the stones beneath his knees, more present than the salty breeze of the Aegean that struck his face. What he saw was happening. What he would record in human words was only the shadow of what the eyes of the Spirit had received. But he tried, word by word, vision by vision, symbol by symbol, with the awareness that human language was an insufficient vessel for what God was pouring into him. He tried to record those scenes for the persecuted churches scattered throughout Asia Minor, for the martyrs who had died without seeing the fulfillment of the promise, for all those who were still living as if history would end the same way it had begun, in confusion, in injustice, with the powerful oppressing the weak and the faithful bleeding on the ground, while the wicked prospered. History would not end that way. And in the 20th chapter of his vision, John arrived at the moment the entire universe had been waiting for, since the first lie was whispered on a garden afternoon, the moment when the account would be settled once and for all, the moment when definitive justice would be exercised, not the imperfect justice of human tribunals, subject to corruption, to favoritism, to the power of gold and the sword, to the selective forgetting of those with enough influence to erase their crimes from the records. The justice of the White Throne, immutable, total, eternal, absolutely just. But before the White Throne, there was the millennium, and before the millennium, there was the chain. An angel descended from heaven. John watched him approach with the attention of someone who had learned, throughout that extraordinary vision, that every detail mattered, every gesture, every object, every movement carried weight of meaning that surpassed what the eyes could capture. There was no pomp in the descent of that messenger. There was no announcement of trumpets. There was no retinue of other angels accompanying him. He came in silence with two objects in his hands. A key, large, heavy with authority that transcended any human metal, and a chain, a great chain that clinked with a sound that echoed through dimensions that physical ears would never reach. And John understood what was about to happen. He had known that enemy. He had seen his work over decades of ministry. He had buried friends who had fallen before his temptations. He had wept over churches that had bowed before his deception. He had seen the power of that adversary operating behind empires that rose upon the blood of the innocent, behind philosophies that transformed lies into elegant systems of thought, behind corrupted religions that used God's name to serve their own appetites, behind persecutions that tried to erase the name of Jesus from the earth. And now the angel was descending with the key and the chain. The great dragon would be bound. The angel encountered no resistance worthy of the name. There was no balanced battle between equivalent forces. There was no epic confrontation of cosmic powers clashing on equal terms. The ancient great dragon, the one who had been called Satan, the devil, the accuser of the brethren, the original serpent, the father of lies from the beginning, the prince of the power of the air, was seized as if he were nothing, as if all his infernal glory and all his power accumulated over millennia of activity on the earth were less than the shadow of the messenger who came to fulfill the divine decree. He was bound with a solidity that knew no negotiation, wrapped in that chain that no created power could break. He was cast into the abyss, the place of total constriction and confinement. The abyss was closed over him with the authority of the key the angel carried, and a seal was set. 1,000 years. 1,000 years without the great deceiver operating freely on the earth. 1,000 years without that voice that had whispered lies into the ears of kings and beggars, of philosophers and farmers, of saints who wavered in their darkest hours, and of the wicked who hardened still more before every offer of grace. 1,000 years without the one who accused the brethren before God day and night, tirelessly, without the one who roamed the earth like a roaring lion, seeking someone to devour, without the one who had turned the world into an arena of systematic deception from the days of Adam until that moment. He had been removed. The chain had been placed. The abyss had closed. The purpose was clear, that he should deceive the nations no more until the 1,000 years were completed. Because deception was his most powerful instrument, more devastating than any physical weapon, more efficient than any army that had ever marched upon the earth. Deception had toppled empires from the inside. It had corrupted pure religions until they became instruments of evil. It had transformed men created in the image of God into willing servants of an agenda that destroyed them while promising them freedom. Deception was at the root of every sin that had stained human history since that first day in the garden. And for 1,000 years, that voice would be silenced. John lifted his eyes and saw something else. He saw thrones, not a single throne, multiple thrones, arranged in authority that emanated a dignity that human palaces only imitated from afar, like shadows imitate real objects. And upon them, seated in that authority which no earthly monarch had ever truly exercised, were those to whom had been given the power to judge. And John saw the souls of those who had been beheaded for the testimony of Jesus and for the word of God. The martyrs. Those who refused to bow the knee before the beast, when bowing the knee meant surviving another day, eating another meal, breathing a little more air. Those who did not worship the image of the beast. Those who did not receive the infamous mark on their foreheads or on their hands, even when refusal of the mark meant being excluded from commerce, from society, from economic survival, from basic security. Those who had bled for the faith, when bleeding for the faith cost absolutely everything. They lived, and they reigned with Christ 1,000 years. This was the first resurrection. Blessed and holy was the one who had part in it. Over these, the second death had no power whatsoever, that power which the great enemy had wielded as his supreme threat, eternal extinction. The definitive separation from God was utterly empty before those who had died in the faith. They had passed through death once, some by fire, some by the sword, some thrown to the beasts of the arenas, while Roman crowds applauded the spectacle, as if the suffering of a human being on account of faith were fitting entertainment for a leisure afternoon. Some crucified with the same cruelty that had been applied to their Lord before them. Some stoned like Stephen, the first martyr who had seen the heavens opened while the stones fell upon his body and had asked the Lord not to charge that sin to those who killed him. Some torn apart, some dying of hunger in damp dungeons, in silence, with no one around to document the name or the faith that had sustained them until the last breath. Some dying of old age after decades of silent faithfulness, in places where being a Christian never attracted the attention of persecutors, but cost equally, day after day, resistance to the appeal of a world that wanted their conformity. But that death had been only a door. Only a door. And on the other side of the door was a crown, a throne, an inheritance that did not corrupt with time, that was not tarnished by continuous use, that did not wither with the passing decades, because time had ceased to exist in the way they had known when they were still on this side of the door. They were priests of God and of Christ. The full dignity of that title was impossible to capture within the limits of human language. Priests, those who mediated, who interceded, who lived in the presence of God as a vocation, and not as an occasional visit from someone who appears in moments of extreme need and then returns to their habitual life, priests of the God of the universe himself and of his Son. And they reigned, 1,000 years contemplating the face of the one who had said that where he was, they would also be. 1,000 years away from the weeping that had marked their final earthly hours, from the mourning that had accompanied every forced farewell, every execution, every moment when hope seemed a light too distant to illuminate the immediate present, away from the pain that had accompanied every martyrdom, away from the persecution that had made their churches gather in catacombs and caves, in whispers, with sentinels posted at entrances to warn when soldiers approached with torches and chains and imperial authority to arrest anyone who pronounced that name, away from the doubt that had eroded so many nights of vigil during the years on earth, when faith seemed madness to the eye that saw only the present and the silence of God seemed unbearable. And the only available response was the decision to continue. Not because there was sufficient proof that everything made sense, but because there was sufficient trust in the one who had promised it would make sense. The millennium was the reward of those who had endured. The confirmation that Calvary had been worth it, that the empty tomb was not an illusion of desperate people who wanted to believe in something impossible because the alternative was intolerable, that the promise had been real, more real than any promise that any emperor or philosopher or corrupted priest had ever made throughout the entire span of human history. Because those promises were made by beings with limited power over reality, and the promise of the risen one was made by the only being who had demonstrated power over death. The reality was this: they had staked everything on the resurrection, and the resurrection had been real, but the millennium was not the end. It was only the antechamber, and then the 1,000 years came to an end. And it was at that exact moment that everything changed again. Satan was released from his prison. Not by accident, not by divine carelessness, not because the abyss had failed in its structure or the chain had weakened with the wear of time, as if the confinement of a spiritual being operated by the same principles of physics that govern human iron and concrete. By the sovereign decree of God, for reasons that divine sovereignty need not justify to its creatures, the great enemy was freed for a brief period. And what he did, the instant the seal was broken and the chain was loosed, revealed the fundamental truth about that nature which had never been transformed in 1,000 years of confinement. Because the prison had not produced repentance, it had not produced humility. It had not produced any sign of genuine brokenness, no evidence that that rebellious will had been bent into submission to the Creator who had been defied from the beginning. It had not produced acknowledgement of defeat in the depths of his being. It had produced only more concentrated hatred, purer in its wickedness, more focused in its destructive purpose. Like a liquid that evaporates and leaves behind only the essence of what it always was, the millennium of confinement had evaporated any vestige of disguise and left only what Satan had always been since the day iniquity was found in him. Satan came out of prison and immediately went to work. He traversed the earth with an urgency that knew no pauses, that knew no weariness, that admitted no distraction from any of his objectives. The same techniques that had worked from the beginning, the same narratives that had overthrown the human heart in every generation, adapted with the mastery of one who had observed human weakness for longer than any created mind could calculate. The lies about the injustice of God, about the freedom that would be available to those who chose their own path away from divine authority, about the real possibility of defying what could not be permanently successfully defied, about the viability of gathering sufficient forces to change the outcome of a war that had already been decided. And the nations listened. The scriptures called them Gog and Magog. John borrowed that image from Ezekiel, from the prophet who had spoken centuries earlier of an enemy coming from the north, of a coalition of peoples rising against the people of God on a scale that seemed irresistible. But here, in Revelation, Gog and Magog were not specific peoples marked on a geographical map with borders and capitals. They were the totality of the iniquitous world. All those who in every generation had lived as if God did not exist, or as if he existed but was not relevant to their daily decisions, or as if his absolute authority over creation could be defied with permanent impunity, as if judgment were always a distant threat that would never truly arrive. All of them summoned, gathered for the last time by the master of deception. Their number was like the sand of the sea. John tried to imagine such a number. He tried to find a human parallel for a multitude that the sand of the sea described with more precision than any numeral. And there was no adequate parallel. There was no human army that came close. There was no concentration of people in any event in history that served as a comparison. It was the sum of all the generations, of all those who had refused grace, who had hardened their hearts before every offer of redemption, who had preferred deception over truth, with the full freedom of those who make conscious choices and refuse to acknowledge their consequences, all marching together for the last time. They marched across the surface of the earth with the arrogant confidence of those who believe that the force of numbers equals guaranteed victory. They advanced toward the camp of the saints, toward the beloved city of God. From every side, the siege closed with the deliberate slowness of one who wants the besieged to feel the weight of each step that reduces the distance. In that scene, there was an echo of every siege that the people of God had suffered throughout all of human history. Of Pharaoh pursuing Israel to the shores of the Red Sea, convinced that the water would be the tomb of those fugitive slaves. Of Sennacherib surrounding Jerusalem with a monumental pride that preceded the destruction of his army in a single night. Of Nebuchadnezzar demolishing the temple brick by brick while the priests still tried to carry out their rituals in the final moments. Of Rome destroying the holy city in 70 after Christ with the fire that consumed what had been built over centuries of devotion, every oppression, every persecution. Every moment when the enemies of God seemed to win and the people of God seemed on the brink of the end, all of it was echoing in that definitive siege like the final note that contains within it all the notes that preceded it. The camp was surrounded, the beloved city was besieged, and Satan, looking at that army he had gathered with the skill of the supreme deceiver, felt for the last time that sensation that had fueled his rebellion from the beginning. The sensation that this time would be different, that this time the assembled force would be sufficient, that the outcome had been miscalculated the first time, and that now, with armies like the sand of the sea, the equation had changed. And then the fire came down. There was no battle, absolutely none. There was no military strategy that was formulated and then countered by a superior strategy. There was not a single war cry that found an answer before being silenced. There was no vanguard that advanced and was repelled, forcing a strategic retreat. There was no last-minute negotiation. There was no truce. The fire simply came down from heaven with a speed and a completeness that left no space for reaction, for flight, for any attempt at resistance on the part of any creature that found itself in that army. God did not need to summon angelic armies. He did not need to mobilize heavenly warriors in battle formation. He did not need swords or stratagems or any artifice of war as men know it. He did not need to calculate probabilities or assess the adversary's capacity before acting. The total sovereignty of God over creation manifested in the most direct way possible. The fire came down and devoured. Silence. Where an uncountable army had stood, there was only silence and ashes, and the definitive proof that the force of numbers had never been and would never be a valid argument against the authority of the Creator, who had made the sand of the sea, and who therefore could never be intimidated by comparisons that had the sand of the sea as their reference scale. And the devil, the one who had seduced them, who had promised victory, who had gathered that final army with the rhetoric of refined hatred and the promise of a freedom he could never deliver, had nowhere to run. There were no more nations to seduce. There were no more crowds available for new lies. There was no more argument that could be constructed from the ruins of that defeat. He had reached his irreversible end. He was cast into the lake of fire and sulfur, where the beast already was, where the false prophet already burned, with the certainty of one who has descended to a place with no exit. There, in the place that had been prepared, not for men, but for the devil and his angels, the great adversary of all creation fulfilled his inevitable destiny, the destiny that had been sealed at the very moment his rebellion had begun, even though its fulfillment had waited throughout the entire span of human history to manifest itself completely, and he would be tormented day and night, forever and ever, without end, without pause, without relief, without the possibility of extinction, that would make the suffering at least temporary. The great deceiver had been definitively silenced, but the story had not ended, because there was still something that needed to happen, something that all of humanity, from Adam to the last human being who had breathed on this earth, from the first man who had buried a brother to the last who had closed his eyes before the end of all history, needed to face. Not a battle with armies, not a war with fire and swords and the cries of those who fall. A tribunal. Silence fell over the universe in a way different from all the silences that had existed before. It was not the silence of the early morning before a storm, when animals stop making noise and the wind ceases and the air hangs suspended in a stillness that anticipates the violence about to come. It was not the silence of a waiting room before a diagnosis that will change a life forever. It was the silence of the end of an era. The silence that precedes the weight of a judgment that has no appeal, that has no higher court, that has no second opportunity for review, that admits no new evidence presented at the last moment by a skilled lawyer. John was standing before what came next. And what came next changed everything he thought he had understood about the majesty and holiness of God. He saw a great white throne, white as snow that has never been stepped on, that has never been stained by the footprint of any creature, white as light before being decomposed by the prism into its constituent colors, when it is still only purity without division. White as the holiness of a being who has never known stain at any moment of the eternity that preceded time and that stretched infinitely beyond time, who has never known compromise with what was impure, who has never needed to look at his own acts and find anything to be ashamed of, because there has never been anything like that to find. The white of that throne was not the absence of color as the white of an empty page. It was the presence of a holiness so absolute, so dense in its perfection, that any other color in its immediate proximity would lose all reference to itself and become only part of the radiance that emanated from that presence. Great, like nothing John had seen throughout that extraordinary vision. And he had seen things that challenged every capacity for scale in the human mind. The 4 living creatures, the 24 elders, the angelic hosts in numbers that surpassed any possible census, the seals broken, the trumpets sounded, the bowls poured out upon an earth writhing under the weight of righteous wrath. He had seen the woman clothed with the sun, and the 7-headed beast, and the dragon that pursued with a hatred lasting millennia. He had seen the final battle and the fire that came down. And after all of that, the white throne was still greater than anything that had preceded it in the vision. But the greatness of that throne was not a greatness of measurable physical dimensions. It was a greatness of authority, of absolute and unprecedented jurisdiction, the greatness of a power that reached every atom of everything that had existed or still existed in all of created existence, without exception, without gap, without a single blind spot, and there was someone seated upon it. John did not describe the face in detail, because there were no words for the face. Human language had been built to describe the created world, and what was seated upon the white throne was the creator of all the created world, whose face creation could not directly sustain without yielding. There was only the effect of the presence upon everything around, and the effect was this: the earth and the sky fled from his face, not metaphorically, not as a figure of speech to express intimidation or deep impression. The earth and the sky fled, the heavens and the earth, the entire structure of the created cosmos, the entire physical reality that had served as the stage for human history throughout all its span. From the first days of creation described in Genesis, when the Spirit hovered over the waters and the Word said, "Let there be," and there was, could not remain in the presence of the holiness of the one seated upon the white throne, and no place was found for them. There was nowhere to flee that was not toward that face. There was no dimension or direction or angle of escape available to creation before its absolute creator. The universe had been created out of nothing by the word of the one now seated on the throne, and the creation that had served its purpose throughout the entire span of history simply receded and yielded before the weight of that final presence, like a stage that dissolves after the drama has been performed, and what remains is only the director who had conceived it. And then the dead began to arrive. Not just some of the dead, not just the dead of one generation or one era or one specific nation. John saw the dead, great and small. That distinction was important, fundamental, because in human tribunals, greatness and smallness frequently determine access to justice, the weight given to testimony, the ability to influence the outcome. The great have better lawyers. The great have connections that shape verdicts. The great have names that weigh in the chambers where decisions are made. And the small often discover that human justice is a system that functions differently depending on which side of the distinction they find themselves. Before the white throne, great and small stood, together, without distinction of access, without privilege of class, without the cushioning of influence that the powerful had purchased throughout their entire earthly existence. Kings who had governed empires, standing. Beggars who had died without anyone noting their name or the date of their departure, standing. Philosophers who had built entire systems of thought to justify the rejection of God, standing. Tyrants who had persecuted the saints with all the cruelty that power disconnected from any vertical accountability permits, standing. Ordinary people who had lived entire lives without great public crimes, but with a heart permanently closed to grace, standing. Those who had died young before accumulating long histories. Those who had lived a century and filled each decade with choices that had moved them further and further from the God who had created them. Standing. The sea gave up its dead. Those who had sunk to depths where no human funeral rite could reach them. Those who died in storms in the middle of the Atlantic. Those who descended to the floor of the Mediterranean in naval wars. Those who drowned in nameless rivers in regions without maps. The sea returned them. There was no depth sufficient to retain what that moment claimed. Death gave up its dead. Death, which had been, since the day it entered the world through disobedience in the garden, the most feared instrument of all human existence. The shadow that hung over every cradle and every sickbed and every battlefield gave up what it had kept. Every soul that had passed through its door, every last breath that had marked the end of an earthly life and the beginning of a condition that the living cannot imagine with precision. Hades gave up its dead. The intermediate place, the place of waiting, the place where the souls of the unsaved had remained since their deaths in anticipation of that moment, opened what it had kept, and they were judged, each one according to his works. Then the books were opened. Books. John did not specify how many, only that they were opened, that there were several, and that they contained the record of everything. Here was the human impossibility of hiding from God, made completely visible for the first time in a way that all of humanity could see simultaneously. Here was the answer to every person who had lived as if God were not watching, as if acts performed in darkness remained in darkness, as if thoughts that were never spoken aloud were private forever, as if the motivations that hid behind apparently good actions were not visible to the Creator, who saw beyond surfaces and reached the depths where human beings were not even honest with themselves. The books were open. Everything was in them, every word spoken, every word not spoken when it should have been, every act of kindness and every act of cruelty, every moment of honesty and every lie, from the small ones that seemed harmless to the great ones that had destroyed entire lives. Every time someone heard the call of grace and deliberately chose to look away, every time the heart hardened before a truth that demanded surrender, every injustice practiced under the cloak of earthly impunity, every time love of self surpassed love of the other, every vice cultivated in secret, every virtue displayed in public with the intention of impressing rather than serving. Everything, absolutely everything. And John noticed something that deserved all attention. The dead were judged according to their works. The judgment took into account the works, not the good intentions that never became action, not the plans for change that were indefinitely postponed, not the correct theologies about the nature of God that coexisted comfortably with lives that contradicted every principle of those theologies. The works. What was actually done or not done with what was received. And it was at that moment that the other book was opened, the book of life. A single book, in contrast with the books, plural, that recorded the works. A single book that recorded names. The names of those who had been redeemed, the names of those whom the Lamb had purchased with his own blood, the names written since the foundation of the world, as the scriptures say elsewhere in Revelation, with an antecedence that defied any temporal category that human beings could handle. The names of those who had believed, of those who had received grace with the open hands of faith, of those who had understood at some moment in their lives that their own works would never be sufficient, and that only the merit of the Son of God could sustain them before a tribunal of this magnitude. The book of life was opened, and there were names in that book that were not standing before that throne, because those whose names were written in the book of life had participated in the first resurrection. They had reigned with Christ. They had been presented without blemish. The judgment of the white throne was the accounting of those who were standing before the throne, and none of those standing before the throne would be found in the book of life. And here was the heart of the terror of that judgment. It was not the magnitude of the works recorded in the books. It was not the accumulated weight of every sin, every rejection, every hardness of heart. It was the absence of a name, a single name absent from a single book. And that absence determined everything. Because the judgment of the white throne was not primarily about what had been done, it was about who had accepted or refused what had been done by the Son of God at Calvary. The works confirmed and revealed the state of the heart. But the heart that had remained closed to grace was what produced the fatal absence in the only book that mattered. And everyone who was not found written in the book of life was cast into the lake of fire. Each one, without exception, without review, without recourse to a higher court, because there was no higher court than the white throne in the created or uncreated universe, without the possibility of arguing that the circumstances had been unjust or that the opportunities had been insufficient, because the God who judged was the same God who had prepared the cross before the foundation of the world, and who had sent the Holy Spirit to work in the hearts of every human being who had ever breathed upon this earth, calling, summoning, knocking at the door, offering grace with a persistence that rejection never deserved. And then John saw the last thing. Death and Hades were cast into the lake of fire. This is the second death, the lake of fire. Here was the abolition of something that had defined human experience since the day it entered the world through disobedience. Death, the final enemy of whom Paul had spoken in Corinthians, the last enemy that would be destroyed, was cast into the lake of fire, along with the instruments and places that had served it. Hades, the place of waiting, the holding room of human history between individual death and the final judgment, had fulfilled its purpose and was now discarded along with everything that had belonged to the old era that was ending in a definitive and irreversible way. Death cast. Death died. What had entered the world as a consequence of human choice and had accompanied every generation of every human being as the constant shadow of the mortal condition was now consumed in the same place that consumed everything that had been judged and sentenced before the white throne. The final enemy was conquered not only in principle, as it had been conquered in the resurrection of Christ, but in complete and manifest reality. What had been guaranteed by the empty tomb on Sunday morning was now fulfilled before all creation, with a finality that admitted no remaining ambiguity. And this is how the old era ended, not with a sigh, not with a gradual fading, not with the slow decomposition of what had been built, but with the clarity of a tribunal that had functioned with absolute perfection, with the exactness of a justice that had forgotten nothing, that had left nothing aside, that had permitted not a single injustice to remain unresolved, not a single crime to remain unjudged, not a single tear of a martyr to remain unanswered. The white throne had fulfilled its purpose, and now there was space for what came next, for what John would describe in the next chapter of his vision, the new heavens and the new earth, the new Jerusalem coming down from heaven as a bride adorned for her husband, the voice of the throne announcing that God would now dwell with men, that tears would be wiped away, that there would be no more death, nor mourning, nor crying, nor pain, because the first things had passed away. They had passed before the white throne, with the completeness of a sentence executed by an authority that had never erred. But John first needed to record what had happened. He needed to put into words those scenes so that the persecuted churches would know that there was a greater reality than the persecution they were suffering, so that the martyrs who were still to come would know that their blood would not be forgotten, so that all those who would live in any generation with their name written in the book of life would know that the white throne was not a threat to them. It was the guarantee of their coming fullness, because the white throne judged everything. But it did not judge twice what had already been judged, and the sin of those who were in Christ had been judged at Calvary. What the white throne would reveal about the saved was not their guilt, which had been cancelled, but their faithfulness, their works born of faith, the rewards that grace had prepared for those who had walked with God, even when walking with God cost everything they had. There was a fundamental difference between standing before the white throne in the resurrection of the unjust and being seated on the thrones around it, reigning with Christ, with one's name in the book of life, and the awareness that the judgment one was participating in was the judgment of those who had chosen darkness when light had been offered. John understood that, and he recorded it, so that there would be no confusion. The white throne was not the end of the hope of the saints. It was the confirmation of their hope. It was the moment when the entire universe would see, with clarity impossible to contest, that God had been just from the beginning, that grace had been genuine and generously offered, that every condemnation pronounced in that tribunal was the result of real choices made by beings with real will who had had real access to truth, that there was no one in the lake of fire who could point to the white throne and say they had been treated unjustly, that the sovereignty of God and human responsibility coexisted in a way that human theology had always struggled to articulate, but that the white throne would reveal with a transparency that dissipated all the fog of academic dispute. God had been just. He had always been just. The white throne merely made that incontestably, cosmically, finally visible. And it was before that vision that John, the old exile on the island of Patmos, concluded the description of the most terrible and most necessary chapter in the history of the universe. With hands that still trembled, with a mind that had been exposed to realities that no language could fully capture, with a heart that had alternated between the terror of contemplating the judgment and the deep peace of knowing that his name was in that book. It was in the book. It had been washed in the blood of the Lamb. It had been sealed by the Spirit. It had been preserved by grace that did not depend on his own capacity for permanence, but on the faithfulness of the one who had promised that nothing could snatch his own from the hands of the Father. The white throne existed, And for those who were in Christ, that truth was not a threat. It was the most solid guarantee the universe could offer that justice would be fulfilled, that evil would be destroyed, that the suffering of the faithful had weight and value, that no tear had been shed in vain, that no prayer had risen to heaven without being recorded, that no faithfulness exercised in obscurity would be forgotten when the books were opened. The white throne existed, and the Lamb was seated upon it, and his legacy was not the lake of fire. His legacy was the new creation that awaited on the other side of the judgment, ready to receive his sons and daughters with the fullness of an inheritance that no eye had seen, no ear had heard, no human heart had been able to conceive in all its extent. But the white throne came first, and no human being who had ever breathed would pass through eternity without having passed before it. None. Every word spoken in the shadow would be repeated in the light. Every act performed in secret would be revealed in the presence of all things and all beings. Every choice that had seemed inconsequential in the darkness of a private life would be weighed on the scale of a perfect holiness. And the only thing that could sustain any human being before a transparency so absolute was the name written in the book, the name purchased by the blood of the Lamb, the name that did not depend on the greatness of the bearer's works, but on the greatness of the author's grace. That was the legacy of the white throne for the saved, not the terror of condemnation, but the certainty that grace had been sufficient, that Calvary had been sufficient, that the blood had been sufficient, that the Son of God had borne the weight of the judgment they deserved, so that they could receive the inheritance he deserved. That there was an exchange that transcended all human logic about merit and performance, and that was called grace, redemption, reconciliation, salvation. The white throne would reveal that too. It would reveal to those standing before it in the resurrection of the unjust the depth of what had been refused, the grace that had been despised, the times when the door of mercy had stood open and the heart had chosen to remain closed. And that revelation would not be cruelly additional to the suffering, as if God needed to rub it in the face of the condemned to satisfy some need for humiliation. It would simply be the truth that justice demanded be established with absolute clarity before the sentence was executed, because God did not condemn gladly. God condemned with a solemnity that reflected the weight of what was being lost, with the seriousness of one who knew exactly what the lake of fire meant, what the second death represented, what eternal separation from God implied for beings created for communion with their Creator. There was a gravity in the judgment of the white throne that was not vindictive satisfaction. It was the gravity of a judge who knows the sentence is just, and that its justness does not remove the weight of what is being sentenced. The white throne was not the spectacle of the wrath of a God who had lost his patience. It was the inevitable conclusion of a story in which love and justice had always coexisted, and where justice had waited, with a patience that surpassed all human understanding, through millennia of extended mercy. Through every generation where grace had been offered again, waited for the moment when it would fulfill what love could not do alone. Because God's love had never desired the lake of fire for any human being. But God's holiness could never ignore the choice of any human being who had preferred darkness to light, and the white throne was the place where those two truths met once and for all, with the resolution that eternity would carry as the foundation upon which the new creation would be built. Justice had been done. Love had been demonstrated. Grace had been genuine. Responsibility had been real. And the new universe that would follow, the new heavens, the new earth, the new Jerusalem, the tabernacle of God with men, the tears wiped away, death abolished, pain ended. That new universe would be built upon that foundation, not upon the amnesia of what had happened before, as if the past were simply erased without resolution, but upon the redeemed memory that everything had been dealt with, Everything had been judged. Everything had been resolved with a perfection that no human wisdom could have achieved. And the saved would enter the new creation not with the weight of an unresolved past, but with the lightness of those who know that every account has been paid, every wound has been attended to, every injustice has been dealt with, every promise has been fulfilled. The white throne made that possible. That was why the vision had been given to old John on the island of Patmos, on that Lord's Day, when the Spirit had reached him on his rock of exile and shown him the end of all things, not to terrify the faithful, but to anchor them, to show them that behind every persecution, every martyrdom, every night of doubt, every day when faith cost more than seemed reasonable to pay, there was a throne, white, immense, with absolute authority, and upon that throne was someone who knew them by name, who had written their names in the book before the foundation of the world, who had purchased the right to keep them in that book with his own blood shed on a Friday afternoon at Calvary, who had promised them that he would never leave them nor forsake them, who had said that where he was, they would also be. And the white throne was proof that the one who had made those promises had the authority to fulfill them, had the power to judge them, had the holiness to guarantee that nothing in the universe could invalidate them. The white throne existed, and the name of every child of God was in the book, and that book did not get lost, did not corrupt, was not subject to the erosion of time or the revision of any higher authority, because there was no higher authority than the white throne in all the created or uncreated universe. There was the white throne, and there was the book of life, and there was the name. That name which was given by grace, preserved by grace, presented by grace on the day of judgment, and which would open for its bearer not the lake of fire, but the new creation, the new heavens and the new earth where righteousness dwells, where the Lamb would be the light, where nations would walk in the light of God, where the river of the water of life would flow from the throne forever, where the leaves of the tree would be for the healing of the nations, where there would be no more night, no more need for sun or moon, because God himself would be their light, and they would reign with him forever and ever. The white throne was the threshold. On the other side of the threshold was everything God had promised from the beginning, and the promise was faithful. If this story is touching your heart, subscribe now and activate the notification bell. Here every narrative is a crossing through the sacred pages, and what comes next in this journey through revelation will reveal what no eye has seen and no ear has heard, the new creation that awaits beyond the white throne. Because the white throne was not the end, it was the portal. John finished writing those words with hands that trembled with weight and reverence. And there was no longer any doubt about what had been exiled to silence, because what he had seen on that Lord's Day on the island of Patmos could not be silenced by any emperor who had ever lived or would ever live. The vision was recorded. The words were written. The Spirit had guaranteed they would reach the ears of every generation of every century that would follow. And they arrived. They arrived at the ears of those who suffer on their own islands of Patmos, in their own exiles of injustice, in their own nights of doubt about whether God really sees, whether he really cares, whether faith really has a point of arrival beyond present difficulties. They arrived with the same message they had carried when John wrote them with those aged hands on that rough parchment. There is a throne. It is white, and what is upon it is not an arbitrary or indifferent power. It is a Lamb who was slain and who returned to life, and who reigns now and will reign forever, and whose reign is not the domination of the strong over the weak, but the restoration of everything that was lost, the healing of everything that was wounded, the justice of everything that was unjustly treated, the reward of everything that was faithful, the fulfillment of every promise that had seemed too great to be real. The white throne existed, and the legacy of that throne was this: that love wins, that grace saves, that justice is fulfilled, that the new creation awaits. that the name written in the book of life is the most precious possession any human being can hold, more precious than all the empires that the powerful of the earth had accumulated, more lasting than all the glory that the great of the world had displayed, more real than anything any human hand had built upon this earth that fled from the presence of the white throne. The name was in the book. The book was at the throne. The throne belonged to the Lamb, and the Lamb had conquered. If this narrative has planted in you a certainty that did not exist before, or strengthened a faith that was already in you but needed an anchor, write in the comments, "My name is in the book," because that declaration is the most important any human being can make. Not the declaration of impeccable works, not the declaration of a life without errors or a theology without doubts, but the declaration that the Lamb who opened the seals, who defeated the dragon, who is seated upon the white throne, that Lamb is yours, and your name is in the book he keeps. This is the inheritance of the saints. This is the legacy of the white throne. This is the end of the story, and the beginning of everything that will have no end.